Professional racers rode it once and refused to get back on. In 1970s California, one man built a motorcycle in his garage that no factory would touch, a machine so brutally overpowered and so impossible to control that it became legendary not for winning races, but for what it did to the men brave enough to try. This isn't a story about engineering triumph. It's about what happens when one man's obsession outpaces every safety limit ever written, and the machine he left behind that no one could tame. In the next 20 minutes, you'll know exactly why. Now, when most people think about dangerous motorcycles, they think about power figures, 1,000 cc, 200 horsepower, top speeds that stop making sense at a certain point, and those numbers are impressive, sure, but real danger. The kind that gets written about in racing histories decades later and whispered about in paddocks by people who were actually there. Real danger is a different thing entirely. It's not just about how fast something goes, it's about why it goes that fast, and what happens when the man riding it makes one small mistake. Today we're talking about a motorcycle that was built not by Honda, not by Kawasaki, not by any factory with a racing department and an unlimited development budget. It was built by one man in a small shop in Southern California in the early 1970s. A machine that blurred the line between motorcycle and projectile. A machine that, in many ways, was so far ahead of its time that the ideas behind it are still shaping the sport today. And a machine that cost people dearly in the process of proving it was right. This is the story of the most dangerous motorcycle ever built in a California garage. To understand why something this extreme was built in the first place, you have to understand what motorcycle racing looked like in America during the late 1960s and early 1970s. Because the context matters. It always matters. This was the era of the Big Four: Honda, Yamaha, Kawasaki, Suzuki. They had arrived, they had swept the market, and they were beginning to dominate racing in a way that frankly embarrassed the rest of the world. The CB750 had landed in 1969 and had basically redefined what a production motorcycle could be: smooth, reliable, fast. Everything the British industry had spent decades promising and never quite delivering at scale. But here's the thing about production motorcycles, even really good ones. They're built with compromises. They have to start in the cold. They have to survive neglect. They have to carry luggage, pass noise regulations, and be ridden by people who are not, in fact, professional racers with 10 years of track experience. And for a certain type of person, a very specific, very intense type of person, those compromises are completely unacceptable. Those people were called privateer racers. They were mechanics and dreamers and obsessives. Men who spent their weekends stripping a motorcycle down to its absolute skeleton and rebuilding it into something purpose-built for one thing only: going faster than everyone else around the next corner. Most of them worked within reasonable limits. They'd bore out an engine, upgrade the suspension, tune the carburetors, fit a better exhaust. Sensible modifications. The kind of thing that makes a fast bike faster while keeping it, at least in theory, manageable. And then there were the ones who didn't work within reasonable limits, the ones who looked at what everyone else was building and decided that the whole concept of reasonable was an obstacle, not a guideline. One of those men was Don Vesco. Now, if you know anything about land speed records, you know that name. His brother Rick set multiple records at Bonneville over the years, and the family name became almost synonymous with pushing the absolute outer edge of what a motorcycle could do on a long, flat stretch of salt. But Don, the older brother, was a different kind of racer. He was a road racer, and in the early 1970s, he set out to build something that would win races. Not by a small margin, by an embarrassing one, by a margin that would make everyone else question whether they were even in the same sport. What he built was, by almost any reasonable definition, a monster. The concept itself is simple enough to say in a sentence. Take two Yamaha TD22-stroke racing engines, each one already a serious competition unit, not a street motor, and mount them side by side in a single custom frame to create, in effect, a parallel twin two-stroke that no factory had ever produced or would ever dare to produce. Two engines, one motorcycle, and absolutely no safety net built into any part of the design. Now, the TD2 by itself was already a serious piece of machinery. This was a 250 chi two-stroke built specifically for racing, producing somewhere around 40 horsepower in proper tune. That might not sound dramatic by modern standards, but in a motorcycle that weighed barely 220 pounds, 40 horsepower was genuinely ferocious. The power-to-weight ratio of a well-prepared TD2 was comparable to purpose-built race machines from manufacturers with far greater resources. It was the kind of motorcycle where you felt the performance acutely, immediately, in a way that larger and heavier machines simply don't communicate. So what happens when you effectively double that? You get approximately 80 horsepower in a motorcycle that Vesco managed to keep under 300 pounds. Think about that number for a moment. The power-to-weight ratio we're talking about here wouldn't be out of place on a purpose-built superbike from 2 decades later, on a motorcycle built in a garage by one man, with no factory support and no corporate budget. The performance was extraordinary by any standard, in any era. But here's where the story gets complicated, because raw performance numbers only tell half the story. The other half is how that performance arrives. Two-stroke engines, unlike the four-strokes most people are familiar with, don't have a smooth and linear power delivery across the rev range. They have what engineers call a power band, a specific, relatively narrow RPM range where the engine produces its maximum output. Below that range, the engine is almost polite, almost docile. You could be forgiven for thinking it was something manageable. And then it hits the power band and everything changes completely. The transition can be so abrupt, so violent, that riders who haven't experienced it before describe it as a physical shock, like something hitting the bike from behind. On a single TD2, managing that power band is a skill. It takes practice and feel and a rider who knows the machine deeply. You learn to anticipate it. You learn to position yourself correctly on the bike before it happens, to flow with it rather than fight it. Now imagine doubling it when both of Vesco's engines were in their power band simultaneously, when they were both at exactly the right RPM, at exactly the same moment. The power delivery was, by all accounts, almost violently abrupt. One rider who tested it described it as being hit from behind by something you never saw coming. Another said that the first time he opened it up fully on a straight, he nearly went over the bars before the front wheel had even thought about lifting. The machine demanded a level of physical and mental preparation that went far beyond anything the sport had previously required. And yet, the frame itself was a custom fabrication, designed by Vesco to distribute the two engines as symmetrically as possible and keep the center of gravity as low as the configuration allowed. By the standards of the time, the chassis work was genuinely sophisticated. Vesco clearly understood that all that power was worthless if the motorcycle couldn't be pointed in the right direction. He used suspension components from units considered top of the line for that era and spent considerable time getting the geometry to work correctly with the very unusual weight distribution that two side-by-side engines created. The result was a motorcycle that handled just about. Riders experienced enough to respect it, said the chassis was actually quite good given what it was being asked to do. Predictable, in its way. The problem wasn't that it couldn't be steered. The problem was that when the power came, the chassis was being asked to manage forces that it had never been designed for, and that nothing in the history of the sport had prepared anyone to anticipate. There's a thing that happens in motorcycle racing when a machine is too fast for the infrastructure around it. The track isn't wide enough. The barriers aren't strong enough. The rider's reflexes, even the best reflexes in the world, aren't quite fast enough to manage every situation the machine is capable of creating. And in racing during this era, the safety culture was, to be generous about it, minimal at best. Riders of the 1970s ran on circuits that would be considered completely unacceptable today. Hay bales for barriers, minimal runoff, spectators standing in places where no modern racing authority would allow any person to stand. The attitude in the paddock was, broadly speaking, that danger was simply part of the deal. You knew what you were signing up for when you strapped on a helmet and rolled to the start line. And if the machine was faster than you were mentally and physically ready for, that was your problem to identify and solve before it solved itself. Vesco's machine pushed this already dangerous calculus to a very dark place. The core issue wasn't just the power, it was the timing and the delivery of that power. With a conventional racing motorcycle, a rider who gets into trouble has a brief window, fractions of a second, but still a window, where the situation is potentially retrievable, where closing the throttle or applying a brake or shifting body weight will bring things back under control. That window is small. It demands everything a rider has, but it exists. With Vesco's twin two-stroke, that window was dramatically smaller. The step from controlled to completely uncontrollable was shorter than anything the riders testing it had previously encountered in their careers. One moment the machine was in a manageable state. The next moment it wasn't. And the gap between those two states was almost nothing. There's also the mechanical reliability problem, which in any two-stroke is never trivial, and in a racing two-stroke is a constant negotiation between the rider and the laws of physics. Vesco was dealing with two complete engines, which meant two of everything that could go wrong, two sets of carburetors to keep in tune with each other, two sets of reeds to inspect before every session, two separate mechanical systems that each had their own way of misbehaving, and whose misbehavior, if it happened at the wrong speed in the wrong place, could change the entire direction of a rider's day in a single instant. The synchronization question was particularly challenging. Getting both engines to deliver power consistently and simultaneously at the same moment in the same proportion required constant attention and constant adjustment. When they drifted out of sync, when one side was pulling harder than the other by even a small amount, the handling became unpredictable in ways that were very difficult to anticipate and almost impossible to correct once they'd started. A bike that wants to turn left when you're trying to go straight is a difficult problem. A bike that wants to turn left at racing speed, in the middle of a corner, with the rear tire already near the limit of adhesion, is a different kind of problem entirely. Vesco understood all of this. He was a meticulous engineer, not a reckless one. He worked on these problems systematically. He tested extensively and made changes based on what he learned. He was not someone who ignored risk. He was someone who tried to engineer it out, one problem at a time. But some problems in the world of motorcycle racing during this era got solved on the track rather than in the workshop. And the track is a deeply impatient classroom. When Vesco actually raced the machine, and he did race it, because that was always the entire point of building it, the reaction in the paddock was something I'd find genuinely fascinating to read about. Other racers came to look at it the way you might look at something that you're glad is separated from you by some meaningful distance. It was impressive in an unsettling way. You could see the engineering, you could see the thought and the skill and the absolute commitment. And you could also see, very clearly, that this was something that operated outside the normal rules of what was possible. In competition, when everything went right, the performance was extraordinary. Corner exit speeds that made no sense relative to everything else on the circuit. Straight-line acceleration that left factory machines looking stationary. There were moments in races where Vesco and what he'd built were doing things that simply should not have been possible with the technology available to a privateer working without a factory behind him. And this is the thing about it that people found both fascinating and deeply troubling at the same time. Because what Vesco had done was essentially answer a question that nobody had officially asked yet. The question being, what actually happens if you just refuse to accept the limitations that everyone else is working within? The answer, it turned out, was this. You build something faster than anyone else has built, and you also build something that requires a very specific kind of person, someone with extraordinary reflexes, complete commitment, and a particular and quite unusual relationship with their own mortality to extract anything productive from it. Most riders couldn't do it, and I want to be very clear that this is not a criticism of those riders. Many of them were genuinely exceptional racers. Many of them had careers that would put them in any honest conversation about the best of their generation. The machine simply demanded more than most human beings can consistently and reliably deliver at racing speeds, under pressure, over the full duration of a race. There's a real lesson embedded in that, and it's one that the sport would spend the following decades slowly and sometimes painfully learning. The fastest thing on a race circuit is not always the thing that wins. The thing that wins is the fastest thing that can be managed consistently and repeatedly by a human being who, no matter how gifted, has a finite amount of attention and physical resource to work with. Push a machine so far past the rider's ability to manage it that mistakes become inevitable and raw performance stops translating into results. It becomes a liability instead of an advantage. Vesco's machine existed right at that edge, sometimes just inside it, sometimes just past it. Now here's where it gets genuinely interesting, because you could look at this whole story and conclude that it was essentially a dead end. A brilliant, dangerous, impractical experiment that never went anywhere because it couldn't. Too extreme for production. Too extreme for sustained racing success. A machine that belonged to a specific moment and then was gone, leaving nothing behind it. And you'd be wrong. What Vesco had demonstrated beyond any reasonable doubt was that two-stroke parallel twin architecture could produce performance numbers that were genuinely extraordinary by the standards of any era. He'd shown that a privateer, working alone without factory support, could build a motorcycle that outperformed factory machines if they were willing to push the fundamental concept hard enough and far enough. That demonstration didn't go unnoticed by people who were paying attention. In the years that followed, the major Japanese manufacturers, who had been dominating racing with single-cylinder and twin two-stroke racers, began looking very carefully at multi-cylinder two-stroke configurations. The technical arguments were well understood by their engineers. More cylinders at the same total displacement means each individual piston is smaller and lighter. Lighter pistons can move faster. Faster pistons mean higher revs. Higher revving engines produce more power. And more power in a competitive racing environment is always and permanently attractive. Yamaha went down this road in a serious and committed way. The TZ series that emerged from their racing department in the mid to late 1970s represents one of the great engineering lineages in motorsport history. Purpose-built, meticulously developed, and extraordinarily effective, those machines went on to win an almost absurd number of races over an extended period. They became the standard by which everything else in their class was measured. I'm not going to tell you that Yamaha looked at Vesco's garage project and built their entire racing program around it. That's not how the world works. The engineers at Yamaha had resources and expertise and testing infrastructure that were in a completely different universe from what a privateer racer in Southern California could access. They arrived at their conclusions through their own rigorous process. But the direction, the fundamental idea that multi-cylinder two-stroke architecture was where the performance lived, that direction was already clearly visible in what Vesco had built. He was a data point, an extreme, expensive, occasionally catastrophic data point, but a data point that pointed unmistakably toward where the sport was heading. There's also another dimension to the legacy that deserves attention, and it's one that's less about engineering and more about the culture of the sport itself. What Vesco's machine made viscerally and undeniably clear was that motorcycle racing needed to think much more carefully about the relationship between what engineers could build and what circuits and safety standards could actually accommodate. A machine that produces that much power in that specific delivery pattern demands different barriers, different runoff areas, different thinking about what happens when something goes wrong at 150 miles an hour. The sport was not having that conversation seriously in the early 1970s. It would be forced to start having it, partly by machines like this one, before the decade was over. I've thought a lot about what to make of a person like Don Vesco. On one level, the story is completely straightforward. A talented engineer with a racing obsession builds the most extreme version of his idea that he can manage, takes it as far as he can, and discovers some of those limits the hard way. That's the story of 1,000 garage projects, most of which never go anywhere near this far or this fast. But there's another level to it that I find harder to dismiss. Vesco knew what he was building. He wasn't naive about the risk. He was a serious and experienced engineer who understood, better than almost anyone, exactly what the machine was capable of and what that capability meant for the person sitting on top of it. He'd spent time on it himself. He understood it as well as anyone could, and he built it anyway, because he believed that the question, how fast can this actually be, was worth asking, even when the answer came with very serious complications attached. There's a version of that attitude that's easy to romanticize. The lone genius in the garage, the obsessive who refuses to be limited by what everyone else thinks is possible. That story has a real appeal, especially in a culture that celebrates the bootstrap inventor and the person who builds something extraordinary from nothing but their own knowledge and determination. But there's another version that's harder to sit with, one that acknowledges that in motorcycle racing, unlike in most other human endeavors, the consequences of miscalculation are not abstract or financial or reputational. They are immediate and physical and sometimes permanent. And the question of whether the knowledge gained is worth those consequences is not one that has a clean or comfortable answer. I don't think Don Vesco was reckless in any simple sense. I think he was a man of his era, operating within a culture that had a fundamentally different relationship with risk than the one we've developed since then. And I think the machine he built was, in its own way, completely honest. It didn't pretend to be something it wasn't. It was extreme, and it was dangerous, and it made no apology for either of those things. That kind of honesty has a value, even when it makes you uncomfortable. The specific motorcycle that Don Vesco built in that California garage is, as far as anyone can determine, gone now. There are photographs somewhere. There are accounts from riders and spectators and competitors who were there. There are stories that get passed around in the small and specific community of people who follow the history of American road racing from this period seriously. But the machine itself, if it still exists anywhere, is not in a museum. It is not being ridden. It is not part of any official narrative that gets told about the sport. That's almost always how it goes with machines like this. They exist at the edge of the record, in the margins of history, known to the people who were actually present and essentially unknown to everyone else, which is, in some ways, exactly where they belong. But here's what I keep coming back to every time I think about this story. Every time you watch a modern MotoGP motorcycle, with its seamless shift gearbox, its traction control, its launch control, and every other layer of sophisticated technology that sits between the rider and the raw performance underneath them, you are watching the end result of a process that started in places exactly like Vesco's garage, with people exactly like Vesco, with questions exactly like his. What happens if you just refuse to accept the limitations that everyone else is working within? The answer, worked out over decades and across the accumulated work of thousands of engineers and riders and race teams and safety officials, is what you see on a MotoGP grid today. Safety standards that would be completely unrecognizable to a racer from 1973. Circuits designed to accommodate speeds that were genuinely science fiction when Vesco was bolting his two engines together. Electronics that manage the relationship between rider and machine in ways that make extraordinary performance accessible rather than overwhelming. The wildness got engineered out. Mostly, the performance stayed and got far, far beyond anything Vesco could have imagined in that garage. And somewhere in the fundamental logic of those modern machines, in the basic engineering principle that says more cylinders, higher revs, better power to weight, is the ghost of a motorcycle that proved the concept before the world was ready for it, before the safety infrastructure existed, before the technology to manage it properly had been developed, before anyone had figured out how to give a rider a fighting chance against that much power delivered in that particular way. It was too early. It was genuinely too dangerous, and it was completely right about where the sport was going. That is the story of the most dangerous motorcycle ever built in a California garage. I'd love to hear from you in the comments below, especially those of you who know this corner of racing history better than most people. Let me know what you think down below, and we'll see you in the next one. Ride safe!